This is part 2 of your lecture for chapter 2 about what is art. So as we move into the idea of art and appearances, we want to look at these two different images here that we're actually going to compare. These are both in your text if you're following along, and we can talk about those. So on the left here we have this artwork called The Painter's Cupboard, and then on the right we have this image called Bottle of Viewmark, Glass Guitar, and Newspaper. And you can see that this here, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the next slide, but we can see here in the parentheses I've labeled this representational, and then over here I've labeled this abstract. So though Picasso himself was a very mastered at this traditional technique, even as a teenager, he soon kind of abandoned it for this style known as Cubism. So Picasso would take these distorted images, as we look at the image here on the right, and he would break them apart. To me, it was the idea that you take a puzzle or you would take glass and you would shatter the glass and then you would try to piece it back together, but it just maybe wouldn't fit just perfectly as it would, so you come up with a new creation out of those scattered pieces here. And then on the left, we see this image with bread, baskets, vessels, and other items, and the way they do when they look in nature. And this truth is very to a more natural appearance, and has been a goal of Western art since the Renaissance, and the European colonization brought this kind of lifelike style of painting to the Americans in the 16th century. Painting in Mexico in the 18th century, the artist took pains to render on the canvas the texture, shapes, colors, lighting, and spaces of his subjects as they appeared to his eye. So going back to Picasso, because obviously this one is understood a little bit more, but this one, we might understand, why did he choose to do this? So, where do we get these ideas, and why did art change all of a sudden? There are many reasons. Picasso himself, when asked, pointed to one particular. He said photography. Why should artists persist in treating subjects that can be established so clearly with the lens of a camera? So, that was his question to the world. If we have photography and we have the use of these technological devices, especially like we have now, we have computers, we have cameras, our phones that we have with us everywhere, they have cameras, so why would someone need to go about painting something like this that's representational? We can merely take a photo of something and have the exact same copy. There may not be as much meaning and value to it because it might be considered, just an iPhone photo or a computer photo over a representational painting, but there is that, idea of kind of, we've talked about before, or maybe we haven't, I'm not sure, but the idea of, is photography considered an art or a science? And what is the value of photography? Is photography as valued as art such as this, like oil on canvas paintings or other similar artworks that are more representational? If you can get the same idea with a photograph. So that's something to maybe ponder about as you look throughout this idea of art and appearances here. So, this is just very interesting to me. So as we move into more representational and abstract art, which is what we're going to talk about here, go over a little bit of the definition. So abstraction art distorts the view, or in general, abstraction versus non-representational art. Abstract art distorts the view or greatly simplifies and reduces the structure of a known thing, person, or place, often in its most elemental geometric components. Non-representational art does not necessarily begin with a thing or a subject in the real world. It can be about line, color, mood, form, shape. The meaning is subjective and allows the viewer to give a more personal interpretation. So as we look at the next artist, like I said, if you're following along in the text, you can look at this work. So this is called Woman with Packages. So this abstract version that the artist created was a visual impact of a standing woman all the way to a slender vertical column topped by an egg-shaped element. It belongs to a series of sculpture that the artist called personages. And a personage is a fictional character, as in a novel or play, like a writer. The artist created a cast of characters in an imagined world. The artist often displayed her personages in pairs or groupings and implied a story for them. So it was very radically simplified forms here that we're talking about. When we look at this work of art, in comparison to maybe other works of art. So this was a big controversy as well when they're talking about, the idea of representational versus abstract. We're simplifying forms. Are we getting the right message? Are we getting the right context? Are artists relaying their message to the right audiences? Are those viewers picking up the cues of what is being said through this type of art. So as we continue on, this would be considered more of an abstract art piece. So as we look at non-representational art, by definition, non-representational art is work that does not represent or depict a being, place, or thing. Instead, we enjoy random splashes of color, geometric shapes, and swirls of texture not necessarily may be found in the real world. So this artist, Elaine de Kooning, this is called Bullfight, is an example of non-representational art. It does not necessarily rely on any representation or pictures of things. There are thick strokes of brightly colored paint made in large sweeping motion, but nothing in the painting is really recognizable. We may understand, we may start to visualize something by the use of this emphasis color in the center and by the title here that we see the work at. But if there was no title, if we just saw this, we might be like, what is this supposed to be? She's considering it to be a bullfight, maybe by the use of very sporadic colors, maybe she was watching something and this is the concept she came up with or how she visualized it. So you have to think about that in terms of non-representational art, because a lot of people might look at this and they might be like, this is a sketch, this is an idea, this is a prompt, this is something that's not yet finished. But maybe for the artists themselves, they were like, no, I was sitting here, I was watching a bullfight, and this is how I envisioned it in my mind. This is how, when I saw it and I put it on paper, this is how it came to life for me. And I think that's just so interesting with non-representational art, because it can be the way that our imagination plays and that we interpret things, and that we visually interpret a concept or something like that, and then how we place that into our artwork. So if you're creating works of art like this and you don't think they're successful, you're like, I'm not really sure where I'm going with these, don't get down on yourself, because they just may be considered non-representational. Maybe you have the story behind them, and maybe that's what you share with your audience or your viewers, or maybe as an artist yourself, you share that. Maybe people ask you questions, maybe you have a little write up next to the artwork, or if people ask, what does this mean? It's non-representational to me, or it's non-representational. Sometimes to me, the term non-representational is more for the audience, not necessarily for the artist. The artist knows what they're representing through their artwork. They created it, but sometimes when they are portraying themselves to a particular audience, or maybe an audience they're not as familiar with, or they're not sure if that audience will be keen or interested in their work, they are more the ones that they title it this non-representational. But to me, the artist is always representing themselves or their thoughts or their imagines or something through their art. So maybe that's a way of helping you to look at non-representational art when you're either creating your own art, looking at art, as you view art, as you look at art throughout these texts. So just keep that in mind. Talking about styles of art, style itself refers to a distinctive, recognizable ensemble of recurring characteristics. So if a person we know always wears jeans and cowboy boots, we identify that person with a certain style of dress. If you walk into someone's house and their family room or living room is entirely antiques except for a very modern chair, you would maybe recognize a mix of style. But if they do this in every room of their house, then this would be mixing styles in their styles, and we would call it eclectic. So in visual arts or other areas of life, style is a result of series of choices. In this case, choices as artists make in creating as a work of art. So if we look at this work, this is called Hairdressing. This is image 2.22. And this is a woodcut by the 18th century Japanese artist Kitagawa Utamura. And as we look at this work, we see this idea of literal styling. So we take, obviously we see that it's a hairdressing. So here we portray this idea that style is what distinguishes artists from other skillful makers. Not all people who set out to make art eventually develop an individual style, but all artists do. So even when, especially I see this a lot when I'm teaching in my classroom, when I'm teaching students a project, if I'm like, okay, everybody's going to do this the exact same way, follow me step by step, so I had one student in particular, one of my AP art students, everything that she did exactly as I told her to, but then she added a sticker to it. And the reason that I found that so profound is because stickers were her thing. That was her way of adding, she definitely had her own style of art. And it's very interesting, especially as a teacher, especially when you have students who create works of art and you're with them, especially schools that I've taught at. I've always been either the only art teacher, there's only been 2 art teachers, so most of the students are very repetitive in my program, especially if they start out as freshmen or in some of their earlier years, and then I see them for 1, 2, 3, or 4 years, I can see them progress, but I also start to notice their style. And then as their work, even if they don't put their name on, I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's so and so's because I can tell by their style, or I can tell by this type of signature marking that they put on it. So every artist does create their own type of style. It may be indirect, you may not even know you're necessarily doing it. Like I said, I can have students, I'm like, okay, do this exactly how I tell you, follow me step by step. And when I walk around, I still see a stylization of each student creating their own work of art. But that's how art is supposed to be. If everybody created the exact same works of art all the time, art would be very boring. So I think the idea of style is not necessarily that art is that each person is creating something different, but I think it's that, once again, we talk about the interpretation, how does our brain see things? How is it interpreted and processed, excuse me, and how do we portray those works back? So if I tell a student to take a paintbrush and dip it in red paint and paint a line on their paper, some people may draw a direct straight line, some people may draw a curved line, some people may draw a zigzag line, some line may be thick, some line may be thin, some people may use one side of the paintbrush, some people may use the other side of the paintbrush. Are any of them wrong? Absolutely not. They all did exactly what I told them to. I told them to draw a line with red paint. But that stylization and how they create their art and how their brain processes art is what makes art stylized in a way. And if you start to look at artists, some artists go through different periods, but even during their periods, you can see that style is representative, and you can kind of identify who that is. So maybe artists do this in one phase, this in one phase, and this in another, or maybe their art is very similar. Like maybe all their works, like one of my big things that I create when I do art is flowers. So in all of my works, there is some either type of flower or some type of flower representation, because that is something that's important to me, and that's kind of my signature along with my actual signature on the artwork. One of my things is that I always incorporate some type of flower or nature scene. So I think that's a really important thing when you think about stylizing or stylization of art. You could have two artworks here, which you do in the text, showing a scene of hairdressing, but because of the style of the artist, they look completely different. But I think that would make things more interesting. If everybody was the same, then it would obviously be very boring. Okay, so as we move on, now we're going to be talking about art and meaning. So essentially the idea that many people ask when looking at a work of art and trying to figure out what the artist is telling us in the image is, what is the artist trying to say? What is the meaning behind this work? And I think I've touched base on that a little bit as we've talked about throughout some of these last few works. Non-representational, I said, maybe the artist, to them it is representational, but to the audience it's not. And so I think that's important as well, to be mindful of those components. So rather than a definitive meaning that can be found once and for all, art inspires interpretations that are many, and they are changeable and interchangeable, I feel like. Art is always about something. One brief definition of art is, in fact, is embodied meaning. Viewers who wonder what the artist is trying to say are thus right to expect their experience of art to be meaningful. However, they may misunderstand where meaning can be found or underestimate their own role in making art. Understanding art is a cultural skill, and like many cultural skills, or any cultural skill, must be learned. So as we look through this section of the text, we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. So focusing on form and content. When we think about it, philosophers have used it to distinguish two aspects. Form is the physical appearance of the work, everything the eye registers about it, such as color, shapes, and internal organization. So a lot of times what I like to do in the beginning, especially when a class is brand new, especially like when I had freshmen in a class, when I taught high school, about the second or third day of school, I would put up an artwork and I would just say, what do you see? What colors? Do you see lines? Do you see shapes? Do you see people? What do you physically see in a work of art? Because a lot of times we try to jump straight into the meaning and we try to figure out what the content is, but we're not really looking at the artwork itself. We just want to know what it's about. But if you look at the artwork, you can start to maybe come up with your own interpretations that may or may not be what the artist is trying to relay, but it can make it a little more interesting for you as the audience. And maybe you are right. Maybe you're like, oh, this is about this story about XYZ. And then when you read about it, you're like, oh, I was right. But then you might look at it and be like, okay, well, the cow and the horse and things, so it must be about a farm. And then you read about it and the person's like, my imagination of outer space. And you're like, okay, well, that's not what I thought. But you have to look at the artwork and understand the forms, the shapes, and things that are represented within the artwork, and just really look at what you see. What do you see in the artwork? And then a lot of times the next question is, okay, what do you see? People are like, I see lines, shapes, people. I see beige, I see red, I see black, I see blue. Okay, so what do you think you see, or what do you think is going on? Now that you've physically looked at the artwork, now you can think about the content. What do you think you see? Okay, is there a story behind this work? Is there a story at all? If we think back to the non-representational art, maybe we don't understand the story. Maybe we come up with our own story, but maybe that's what the artist wanted us to do anyway. So it's really important to think about that as well when you're looking at these works of art. So if we look at these next two images, this is the Adoration of the Shepherds work, and El Greco, also part of the, also an Adoration of the Shepherds. So if we look at these two comparison works here, it's very interesting. So the one on the left is more naturalistic. It's an evening scene. The figures are occupied by a very dimly lit, almost interior space. It almost looks like it's staged, essentially. This looks like maybe a set or a scenery piece where this is sent here. So the form of this painting gives its meaning that communicates the serene yet majestic birth of the faith Savior. As we look at the image on the right by El Greco, there's a very different atmosphere here. It's very moody. It's very unnatural. You've got these very dark kind of figures and colors in the background and in the figures here as well. The figures are very stylized. This looks very more natural. This is something we would actually pass by and see as we were walking in that area. This is something, if you look at the figures and the limbs, we're like, this is not something, we may read about this in a book, or we may see it on some kind of video or media, but this is not necessarily something that we would see in person, that we would, if we were walking by, this would not be a scene that would be natural to us. So their expressions are, very interesting here. So you can see that the difference in content are very different, but the forms themselves, it's the same thing. They're both Adoration of the Shepherds. It's just their interpretation and the way that they use the forms, the figures, the coloring, even how they arrange those forms within the composition to make it visually interesting, or at least visually differentiated. So think about that as well as you're looking at artwork and thinking about art and its meaning. Moving on to materials and techniques here. This work itself is by Auguste Rodin. This is called The Kiss. There are many, many images. I meant to mention this earlier with the David sculpture. There are many artists who created the sculpture or created sculptures and titled them David, just as there are many artists who used this rendition of The Kiss. So if you look at one's off the top of my head, I know Constantine Brancusi made a work, and I cannot, Gustav Klimt, that was the other one. Those are two artists that would be very interesting for you to look up to compare to these two artists. I should have included those in my PowerPoint lecture here, because they are also titled The Kiss, and they're very similar to this. So it's very interesting, once again, that idea of influence and meaning, and how does that work interpret, and who's this considered the original work of art. So I encourage you to look that up. Once again, they're both titled The Kiss. One is by Gustav Klimt, and the other is by Constantine Brancusi. Very modern, very contemporary, not what you would probably expect in comparison to this artwork titled The Kiss, or the sculpture, excuse me. The other two are 2D works of art. This is obviously, no, one is 3D and one is 2D. But I would look into that. But we can talk about that later if you're interested in that. So this work here, in particular, by Rodin, this white marble has long been a standard material for sculpture in Europe, and carving was very standard to be this way. He took this white marble and the technique of carving for granted when he created this, and this has become one of his most famous works. This artwork here, talking about the difference in materials, as we move on to the next page, we look at these artworks by Janine Antoni that are called Na. These were done in 1992. There's a chocolate cube, a lard cube, and a heart-shaped package. And these works are very interesting that the artist created. The artist very much reached far beyond traditional art materials and techniques. Her choices were very fundamental in the work's content, and how the artist chose to come up with these ideas. Chocolate has a strong association with love, as being a token of affection and a substitution for it. Lard kind of summons up the obsessions with the idea of being, or with self-image, which in turn is linked to a culturally imposed ideal of female beauty, as in the lipstick, which we see here. I'm sorry, as we see here, this idea of lipstick. So it's very, very interesting how this kind of romantic illusion is implied here by this work. Maybe that's not exactly what we thought of when we first saw these works, either in our text or as you're listening here in the lecture. Maybe you're just like, okay, what's this? Like, what's going on? Like, I know what these materials are, and I can kind of interpret what they may or may not be. But then when you start to hear the content of them, you're like, oh, that's not what I would have interpreted. That's a little bit more deep. But now that you do know it, maybe you're like, okay, that does represent well of what, feminism, beauty, things like that, which is what this artist is focusing on, the idea of self-image, the idea of chocolate and love and lipstick and this heart-shaped chocolate box, but it's empty and instead the lipsticks lay beside it. Excuse me. But then if you go back here and you see these lipsticks, could you think back to a ready-made? Lipstick has already been invented. We think back to Marcel Duchamp's fountain. Is this considered original? Is it considered a new type of art? Or did this artist simply copy artists before them? Or were they influenced by them? See how that difference comes into those types of art here. So keep that in mind as well. All right, moving on. So icons themselves literally are describing images. It kind of involves the identifying and describing and interpreting subjects in a matter of art. So this artwork here, that's over to the left, is called the Amida Buddha from Japan. It's wood with traces of lacquer in it, and the work was made between 1125 to 75. It's actually pretty small. It's only about 34 inches tall. But this artwork here, to understand the content of this work, you must read the parts of the image that help to identify it. So it's very symbolic, with the title itself. So who is the Amida Buddha? In the Buddhist faith, a Buddha is a fully enlightened being. The historical Buddha was a spiritual leader who lived in India, perhaps as early as the 6th century BCE. His insights into the human condition formed the basis of the Buddhist religion. As Buddhism had developed, it occurred to believers that if there had been one fully enlightened being, there must have been others. In Japan, Buddhism spread very quickly, and the most popular Buddha has been the Amida, the Buddha of the Western Paradise. So you can identify this figure, obviously, as Buddha, maybe without even knowing the title, and that's that idea of icons. This is readily available to people. They understand what they're looking at and what they see through those icons. As we move into the term of context, art does not necessarily happen in a vacuum. There are strong ties that are binded in a work of art into the life of its creator, to the tradition it grows from and responds to, and to the audience it was made for, and to the society in which it circulated. These circumstances form the context of art, the personal, social, cultural, and historical setting in which it was created, received, and interpreted. So as we talk about this work, this is called The Assumption. And this is obviously something you would expect to find in a museum or an art book. Assumption is another name of standard Christian subject art. This is Mary, the mother of Jesus, being accepted bodily into the heaven at her death. The artist imagined Mary being borne upward amid a crowd of angels, her garments swirling around her into a golden glory, and above God appears to welcome her below. Witnesses marvel at the miracle. So while this does not necessarily reside on the white pages of an art book or in a museum, it does tower up behind the main altar of the church, a church in Venice. So I think the interesting thing about this, as we talk about the context, and, we go back to the definition of these circumstances forming the context of art, the personal, social, cultural, and historical setting in which it was created, received, and interpreted. I think those three key end words, created, received, and interpreted, are what make this such an interesting work of art. when we think about art in itself and we think about the way that it was created, received, and interpreted, just because artwork is creative doesn't mean that it's going to be received by an audience or by a group of people, etc. But once it is received, it's then how is it interpreted? Does one culture interpret it in one way? Does another culture interpret it in a different way? And how are those interpretations different based on maybe background, maybe ethical bringings, maybe religious bringings? Somebody who's not a Christian that might look at this might be like, I don't really understand what's going on. Why is this important? But somebody who maybe does understand Christian theology, or at least has studied it or some sort, may be able to answer those questions. So you also have to think about, like it says, the personal, social, cultural, and historical settings in which it was created. So during this time, Christian art was a very prominent subject matter of this time period when this would have been created. So you have to think about that, artists at that time, they were kind of trying to think of how I wanted to say this. They are not necessarily marketing themselves, but they do, it's kind of like now, like, people are influenced by people who are wearing things that other people are wearing as well. It's kind of like that idea of like, okay, well, if this is the in thing and you do the in thing, then people are going to probably notice you and be like, oh, they have, or they wear, or they paint, or they do this. So I think, like that idea of cultural, you kind of adapt to your surroundings. And I think that's very interesting how that also translates into that idea of context. So our last portion of this chapter, we're almost finished, guys. Thanks for hanging out with me, is art and purpose. So a lot of Western artists during the 20th century began to feel that something important had been lost when art was separated from life and placed in this kind of separate, privileged realm. Seen in the larger context of consumer culture, museums and galleries were really so different. Were they so different from places like department stores and boutiques? Despite the talk and meaning of spiritual value, did the role of artist in modern society come down in the end to making objects for display and sale? So, sometimes a perspective is all it takes to know, to open up a new way of thinking. A painting indeed is an object, but it's also the result of a process, the activity of painting, drawing, creating, whatever it is. So, the purpose of art and the role of the art, especially in contemporary culture, many artists begin to shift their focus away from the product. Like I've been mentioning this before, they weren't necessarily worried about the end product. They're thinking about the process, is considered how it might be meaningful for themselves. A lot of time, especially like in the Renaissance, everybody was very conditioned to create this traditional type of art. You had to draw portraits in this manner. You could only draw them from this section of the body up. You had to use this color. It had to be natural. You had to use this lighting. You had to use this background. So when we think about the processes, a lot of those artists probably were not processing. They maybe didn't. Yes, they enjoyed painting the art because they were good at it. It was relaxing. They were being trained by these famous artists, or they were these apprentices for these famous individuals. But at the same time, were they enjoying it themselves, or were they losing themselves within their art? And that's something I think we have to think about when we think about the purpose of art. Not only are we creating art maybe for the world, but are we creating it for ourselves? When we think back to Jack Hampton and his throne, he had this image in his garage, and maybe he didn't intend for anyone to see it. The purpose was for himself. He enjoyed that maybe. He enjoyed that creation. He liked that interpretation and that imagination of his mind, and he liked putting that into that sculpture form, or he liked putting that onto paper, or he liked using it for this and that. So I think that we also, when we create artists, I don't think it necessarily has to have a purpose, but I do think as the artist, it should be purposeful and meaningful to you. And I do think there's a difference in it being meaningful as well as being purposeful. Meaningful means, the idea of, how would I say this? You have an idea and you bring it to life. Purposeful means, could this help someone? Could what you interpret or how you see or do things be a door opening for someone else? And when you think about the idea of perspective, like it talked about, sometimes they say, if you have a block, whether you're a writer, artist, or whatever you do, whatever your specialty or hobby or whatever, maybe it's reading, maybe you build things, maybe you like to do videos, maybe you create content, anything like that. Sometimes you get in this rut or this block essentially, and you're like, okay, what am I going to do? How do I take these next steps? Maybe you always work in your living room, but then maybe The next time you're like, I'm going to go work in my bedroom, I'm going to work in the dining room, I'm going to go work outside, I'm going to go to a restaurant down the street, and it gives you a whole new perspective. You might even see something that influences your creative process and your thinking and how you get to that end result. So necessarily it doesn't always have to have a purpose, but it should be purposeful to you as the artist, or at least I think so. Maybe that's just my general opinion. Maybe that's that subjectivity that's incorporated into art, but just think about that. So we look at this last artwork here by Banksy. This is a mural. It's actually now been painted over on Lake Street in London. This was done in 2008. This is a street artist, known only as Banksy. Paints images on the walls of buildings normally owned by private individuals, companies, and the government. The Banksy mural here has seen comments on our attitudes towards street art itself. This work depicts a city worker mindlessly power washing a prehistoric rock painting off the wall, much as workers routinely scrub unauthorized graffiti from walls today. So the painting here actually draws a parallel between modern street art and the cave paintings of historic art that we now consider to be priceless treasures of human, kind of human documentation and development. Yet, like graffiti artists, the cave painters did not have permits or government authorization to paint their images. They simply made their work for the public to see. So, when we think about art from the 20th century, or just art in general, and especially the last few pages of chapter 2, I really want you to look at those in terms of this idea of art and purpose. The question that many artists of the 20th century posed about the nature of their task and the great formal variety of their response to this question served to map the territory of what we define and how we consider the word art to be defined. We understand that art can manifest itself in many more ways than the 18th century philosophers who invented the category ever dreamed of. We think of a painting, a sculpture, a video, an installation, a website, a computer program, a concept, a performance. Any of these actions and all of these more can be both presented and understood as art if we will allow it to. So I will see you guys in the next lecture. Enjoy.